Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeff Melnick. I'm the Director of Solutions Engineering for Netwrix. Today, we're going to talk about audit and security practices. Focus pretty heavily on Active Directory, but we're also going to talk about servers and other types of data as well. Just to give you a little bit of background on myself, I worked in IT for quite a while. My last position, I did quite a bit of systems engineering work as well. I worked about 10 years for a relatively large organization that had about 300 sites around the world. And I was their primary Active Directory architect and did some other solutions engineering and systems engineering as well. So just to give you a little bit of background as far as who I am and kind of what I'm about. Big fan of Active Directory. Before we kind of dive into things, I'll dive into the agenda here real quick. I just wanted to give you a quick heads up as far as housekeeping. So if you're curious about, hey, is this session being recorded? It is. Also, I'm going to try to keep an eye on the questions window as well. So if you have questions, please let me know. I realize, let me see if I can share my webcam. It's maybe better or worse, hopefully. So cool, and I'll move this out of the way because you probably don't see my face that many times. Awesome. So again, real quick, I'll try to keep an eye on the questions window. If you have questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Also, there's some giveaways as well. So we're giving away 40 different Amazon gift cards. So they're 25 bucks, and that's all compliments of the ISSA. So good luck to you. May fortunes be forever in your favor, as it were. So real quick, what we're going to talk about is, again, securing Active Directory and servers. Really want to talk about some of the problems that I see on a regular basis. Either technology that is available and has been available in many cases for years and just isn't being utilized, or some best practices that a lot of people just don't seem to be aware of. So wanted to kind of touch on some of those. We'll touch at kind of a high level as far as general audit best practices. And then I'll go in and I'll give you kind of a demonstration of some sort of sample audit reports. And I'll go through and I'll show you these through the Netwrix product. You can generate a lot of this data either through PowerShell, there's different SIEM solutions, et cetera. Obviously, everyone has their own take on it. But I wanted to show you a little bit more as far as the types of data you should be looking for. We'll talk about why. And kind of dive into that a little bit as well. So with that having been said, let me dive right in here. So Active Directory, pretty core to everything at this point, right? I think it's something like 97% of organizations leverage Active Directory. Pretty much every server, workstation, bunch of other devices that plug in all really rely on AD to function. Gives you that single sign-on capabilities, the ability to push out policies, all kinds of good stuff. Unfortunately, it can also hold some sensitive data, which is not really what you want to do, but it certainly can do that as well, unfortunately. And because of that, it's really the number one resource for people who want to come in and cause issues, whether it be insiders or even external threats as well. So again, always looking to be wary of insiders, but there's a huge number of external threat actors as well, right? So 70% of breaches are really driven from the outside. So still leaves a large percentage of people to worry about inside your organization, but again, we want to be really careful with how we set up and how we secure our infrastructure. So let's talk about securing Active Directory in particular and sort of systems in general. So this is almost a no-brainer, I think, but update your equipment, right? It's funny the number of times I talk to customers that are running really old equipment. Server 2003, I still occasionally run into someone running something like NT4, and I'm not even joking. It's pretty rough. Now, in some of these cases, they're running one of these older operating systems because it's connected to some sort of lab equipment or something else that some system they just can't replace easily, or they have to deal with then relicensing a product or a piece of hardware, and that can be a pretty significant upkeep. Especially we see it a lot in the healthcare industry, again, universities, a lot of stuff dealing with that. But we still occasionally see, and by we I mean obviously myself, 2003 domain controllers as well, and that's a real issue. Older servers you can kind of firewall behind, leave them behind, do your best to kind of mitigate having to deal with them. But if they're your sort of frontline security mechanisms, that's a bigger problem, right? So, and it's funny because as I was kind of building out this slide deck last week, you're probably aware of this huge DNS vulnerability that was announced just last week on the 14th that allows people to go through and launch remote code against DNS servers. Unfortunately, this affects all DNS servers back to 2003. So this is, again, a classic example of why you really need to be wary of what you're doing and how old your systems are. So if you're running, 2012, 2019 controllers, awesome. No problem, right? So especially, more current controllers, when you go to do the updates, that'll get fixed. If not, you'll have to go through and you'll have to play around with the registry a little bit, right? So if you have some older machines floating around, you're going to need to dig into the registry and make a couple of changes in order to mitigate this vulnerability. So again, one more reason to update your stuff. So again, if you haven't seen this one's pretty critical. So figured I'd throw that out to you. So let's dive into some delegation and least privilege. I see this a lot of problems, especially in smaller organizations. They're not big fans of delegation for one reason or another. Trying to go out and delegate things. So what we see is in small organizations, there's not a lot of delegation. There's a lot of admins floating around that don't need to be there. In large organizations, they tend to put in some sort of additional product that separate out roles, etc. And you can certainly do that as well. But the reality is Active Directory has a number of built-in mechanisms to allow delegation. So there's some built-in groups, so things like the account operators group, server operators. And again, a lot of these I bring up just because when I mention them, I'm sometimes surprised by how many people are just not aware of this, type of functionality. So if this is the first you've heard of it, it may be. Account operators group, very easy to throw in your sort of low-level administrators, help desk people. It gives them the ability to unlock and reset accounts. Pretty straightforward, right? So you can really go through, you don't need to make them domain admins. By making someone a domain admin, or we're set an enterprise or schema admin, for example, gives them the ability to make structural changes to Active Directory. And you have no idea how many times I've seen people break things because they did something incorrectly. So for example, again, organization I used to work for, we were spinning up, I think it was 70 new sites one weekend. And so we're doing a lot of work, as you can imagine. And someone who was basically doing data entry on the subnet side basically mistyped and logically split our data center. So basically put it into two different subnets as far as Active Directory was concerned. If you've ever used Exchange on-prem, you know that it cannot coexist, or it cannot exist rather, without without a domain controller in the same site. And now I had a bunch of Exchange servers in different sites from my domain controllers. And again, if you're not aware of this issue, basically what happens is the server just stops sending mail and it starts spitting out really helpful, Microsoft messages like, hey, this thing's not working, right? Queues start to build, everything's running, you don't know what's going on. So those types of issues can be mitigated by simply not giving people access to break things that are out there. The number of times you need to go out and build, subnets, et cetera, or, perform, trusts, et cetera, is pretty low. So to give someone that level of capability is challenging. You can also create custom delegations as well. So you can do that at the domain level. You can do that also at the OU level. So you can give particular groups the ability to unlock and reset accounts for just a handful of users, for example. Very, very easy to do that. So you can go through that. The only caveat with that, though, is you need to be somewhat careful with that. So for example, one of my issues with custom delegations is the ability to go in and delegate things that probably should not have been delegated. So for example, if I'm going to create a malicious account inside of the network, I could create a malicious account and add to the domain admins group. But For the most part, everyone checks that group. Only the worst groups ever don't at least occasionally look at the domain admins group, right? So if I'm going to create a security delegation or a malicious account, I can go out and basically just delegate myself domain admin rights at the root of the directory or against just the user's container. So do I need to make myself a domain admin if I have the ability to add myself to the domain admins group? Probably not so much. So you do need to be aware of what those are. Yes, yes, they do. So one of the things that I'm reminded of is the 8th level of the OSI model, which is politics. I had a colleague tell me that one time. I thought it was kind of amusing. And that's a big thing that you run into. Everybody needs to have access to everything. Um, Again, there are some best practices, I think, out there that are associated with this. But again, if you're a help desk person, you do not need administrative access. Account operator is tailor-made for that level of access for you. If you want to give someone also the ability to be local admin on certain servers, awesome. Certainly workstations, a lot of times we'll do that. We'll see that as well where you roll that out. Usually through group policy, where you'll push out, hey, everyone in the IT group has administrative access on local machines or local workstations, that type of thing. So again, there are a number of different mechanisms out there. I'm sure some great blog posts. I think I've written some as well out on our site on netwrix.com. So feel free to peruse that as well. Let's see. So fine-grained password and account lockout policies. A number of people use this. Again, it's functionality that was introduced originally in 2008, I think, but it can only be used through PowerShell. Microsoft loves adding in features that are only accessible through PowerShell, and then later on, when they kick off and become popular, building in some sort of GUI for them. This is the case. So you can certainly go in and play around with this in 2012 or above pretty easily. You can go in and tinker with this through Active Directory Administrative Center. It gives you that capability. It allows you to kind of crank down on specific groups. You can do specific users as well if you really want to, but again, classic example of, don't go too crazy. So for example, for IT people, probably want to have longer passwords. You probably are forced to remember 5,000 passwords anyway. You might as well make sure that your password is a bit more secure. So pushing those out against things like IT, especially with lockout durations. IT people, contractors, they tend to be targets for obvious reasons. C-level employees as well, because again, they usually have too much access to stuff as well. So being able to go through and pull that information out is pretty critical. But again, if you're going to create multiple password or account lockout policies, make sure that they're logical. Start small and crank up. Again, IT, HR, finance maybe. Anything where you have people who are dealing with sensitive data. One of the problems that you deal with is things like phishing and spear phishing attacks, right? So those are always rated at either the #1 or a close second every year as far as mechanisms used to breach organizations. So the more access that someone has, their credentials get compromised, the more trouble you're going to deal with. It just makes it that much easier to escalate, right? So that's why, again, not on the slide, but everyone should have a user account, and then if you're in IT, you should probably have a separate admin account with which you actually do stuff. I do occasionally run into people that still have way more elevated rights than they should. If you're a user and you're opening an email, you should not have any administrative rights. That's something you should do through a delegated account. So hopefully that makes sense. So again, start small with a couple different groups. Again, IT is a great one, HR, finance, those types. Depends on the organization, obviously, right? You're dealing with engineering, intellectual property. Make things that make a little bit more sense as opposed to someone who's, working a kiosk or is doing sort of just, processing of pretty basic stuff. So you can go through and break those out. Other thing, group managed service accounts. This is somewhat new. So managed service accounts were released in 2008, R2. Group managed service accounts came out in 2012. So one of the differences, managed service accounts can only be used on a single machine, but group managed service accounts can be used on multiple servers. So if you've got the same service account that runs the same service on multiple servers, you want to go obviously with a group managed service account. Not available for all applications, even all Microsoft applications. There are some issues with running them because of what they need to do. So certain applications can simply not be run with group or managed service accounts or group managed service accounts. They're definitely more secure though, which is nice. You cannot use them to log in interactively, and that's really the big issue, right? So if you've got a application that's performing interactive logons or is going through and that's how it's trying to impersonate credentials in order to operate correctly, and there's probably more of those than you realize, that's not going to work very well. So again, be aware of that. But you can't log on with them interactively. They also automatically change their passwords every 30 days. That's another bonus, especially if you're dealing with compliance and if you ever had to go through and manually change all your service accounts every 90 days, you'll know that's a handy feature because that's pretty tedious, right? So there are definitely some additional attributes that are available. You've also got the addition of the protected users group. This is really designed for admins. It's designed to prevent things like credential scraping, etc. So it's really more client-side protection. So when I log in, I'm able to go out and do stuff, but that local machine will not cache my credentials. So really hard to scrape your credentials if they're not being cached. Caveat to that is you need to be able to make sure you can access the DC. Because if you can't access a DC, you're not going to be able to authenticate against that. As a result, you want to be careful with this group. This is not something you want to just push out to everybody. That would be bad. You definitely don't want to use it with service accounts. That includes managed service accounts and group managed service accounts, or all of your admin accounts, because it is actually possible to lock yourself out. As you can imagine, that's upsetting. Again, user-induced outages are really upsetting, so be careful if you're going to use this. But again, it's got some interesting things. Doesn't cache credentials, resets a lot of the ticket granting timeframes are much shorter. But again, if you're going to roll out protected user groups, and I would certainly recommend you at least take a look at them, be aware that you want to do that methodically. You don't want to do kind of don't jump in with both feet because it can be challenging, create some problems for yourself. So this is another one that I find very interesting. People seem to forget this. Active Directory is readable by just about everyone. You just have to be a user, and you can read pretty much everything in the directory. A lot of people think that, hey, I put something in Active Directory and it's super secret, no one can access it. The funny thing is our product needs at a minimum the ability to be a user, because that's the only thing required to read 99% of the directory structure. When you log in as a user, you need to be able to read the group policies. When I go and I want to email somebody, I need to be able to look up their properties within the global address list. People forget that the directory is readable by just a user by default. Now, why is this relevant? There are people that put out sensitive information in there. One of the bits of sensitive information is occasionally passwords. Why people do this, I don't know. Easy way to deal with it, I guess. But I can tell you, I was talking to a colleague who works as a pen tester. He will go in once he has access to your infrastructure and he gets inside your perimeter. He will start querying your directory structure. He will look at your attributes. And if he sees, hey, temp password for whatever reason for an elevated account, or frankly, even for a regular account, he's going to pull that information out and he's going to use it against you. So do yourself a favor, be very, very careful of what you put in the directory structure. Be cognizant of anything that you put in there can be read by a user unless you go through and you've got specific fields that are locked down, specific attributes. But for the most part, everything is pretty much readable. People forget this all the time. I have conversations with clients all the time about this and why they can do this. They're always telling me, no, you need to be like a domain admin to read this information. You don't. You can very easily just log in as Bob the user and start querying the directory through PowerShell super easily. So please don't forget that. Also, set expirations for temporary users or contractor accounts. This is a pretty handy built-in option in Active Directory on the Users tab, or on the user rather. You go down under the Account tab and you can set an expiration. I used to do this all the time for contractors. Hey, this guy needs access until X. Okay, great. He'll have this till X. This way, if I forget about him, doesn't matter. He'll just automatically expire out. And then obviously it'll be on someone else to let me know if I need to extend that. But very, very easy to set expirations on temporary users and contractors. Again, they are always, always, always big targets for people. If you look at some of the high profile breaches, like I'm trying to think, I think the Home Depot breach in particular, I think even the Target breach, they were using credentials from contractors. Contractors often have elevated credentials because they come in, because they're contracting, they come in and do stuff. And then their account just kind of sits out there and people forget about it. You want to be careful of stuff like that. So if you can, again, it's just the best practice. If you've got temporary users or contractors, set expirations. You should also be checking for things like inactive accounts. If you're dealing with like SOX compliance or really any of the compliances, you're probably doing this already. A number of different ways to do this. Easiest is to look at the last logon timestamp attribute in AD. If you guys aren't familiar with this, try not to veer off into a rabbit hole too much, but there's the last logon timestamp attribute, which is a newer it was introduced in 2003, where it will give you the last logon, but it only gets updated every 14 days, but it's replicated across all the DCs. So relatively good if you're looking for a general, hey, when was the last time someone logged in? That's not to be confused with the last logon attribute, which is not replicated and is different for every user on every DC. So I'll sometimes get users say, hey, this guy says he never logged in. If you didn't authenticate against that domain controller thinks they never logged in. So easiest way, honestly, especially if you're just trying to get a general feel, is the last logon timestamp attribute. You can go out, you can check the last logon attributes, but you're going to need to check all the DCs. Now, again, for compliance, this is hit pretty hard, especially on the user side, because again, you want to know if someone's not logging in, if you got an account log sitting out there. I've seen issues as well where someone gets onboarded, they just don't show up. So they create an account, maybe they have elevated privileges, their account just sits out there with the default temp password that IT creates. Was it QWERTY or whatever crazy 1 2 3 that they come up with for a generic, hey, try this password. Anybody who stumbles across that in the environment can now log in as that user. So again, be aware that that's a potential risk. Computers also you want to take a look at. And I like to look at computers specifically because, especially doing things like migrations with an AD, if you've got a bunch of machines that don't exist, it's going to be really hard to migrate those. It's just going to cause issues. It also just clogs up the directory with stuff that doesn't need to be out there. If you've got a machine that you're offlining, it's broken, whatever, and you're going to throw it in the dumpster, remove it from the directory structure. There's no point in having hundreds or thousands of machines that haven't existed in years. It also allows you to track things like, hey, why hasn't this machine logged in? Is it sitting at someone's desk? They don't work here anymore and I can reprovision it? Did someone walk off with the machine? Again, hey, Bob hasn't shown up in a couple of weeks, he's gone. I'm just going to borrow his laptop and now no one notices. So again, a lot of very obvious reasons on this user side, but you probably want to look at computer accounts for inactivity as well. Again, just trying to get in, again, some of the things that I see. There are additional controls out there that you can use that most people either forgotten about or, especially if you went through and got like your MCSC or something, you may have been like, oh, hey, that's cool. I'll maybe use that, never. But you can set additional controls on accounts as well. So the prevent delegation for privileged accounts is one of them. You can set that so it can't be used for things like impersonation. Again, be careful what you're setting out there, but a lot of people set that by default on administrative accounts. Again, don't go crazy, test it out, make sure it doesn't break anything in your environment first before you roll it out for everybody. But that's a handy one. And then if you're dealing with things like kiosks, for example, you've got specific people logging into specific workstations during specific time frames. you can go through and you can set, workstations that account can log into, and also logon hours. So banks tend to set logon hours, as you can imagine, because they're rarely open beyond those additional hours. So if you try to log in 3 a.m., it's not going to let you. Again, especially with things like kiosks or something where you have specific hardware profiles, also a different story. So it allows you to go through and kind of tailor these. Again, it doesn't have to be for all accounts, and in fact, it probably doesn't make sense for most accounts, but it's another mechanism that you can use to kind of limit availability, especially to specific workstations or to specific users. So hopefully that makes sense. Securing your local admin accounts. This is something that I personally have been dinged on during audits. I used to like setting things up. And let's say I'm going to spin up an HR system where I need 4 servers. I'm just going to use the same admin password on all 4 boxes. At least I would until my auditors beat me up about that. Not very on board with that, right? And their point is obviously, again, if they can access one machine, they get those credentials, they can access all those machines. Agree 100%, right? So you want to go through and make sure all your admin passwords are different. But now you're going to run into other issues as well. One of those is obviously you may have a lot of machines, or maybe just a lot of workstations, right? If you set all of your local admin passwords the same, you get one guy who, especially dealing with work from home, right? Hi, I can't log in, or I have some issues with, I need administrative credentials. You need to get them in those administrative credentials. You don't want to give them the local admin password for every machine on the network. The number of times I see that happen is pretty high. So you want to be careful of that. So if possible, every admin password should be different. Now, how do you approach this, right? PAM solution is a great one. Very easy to do that. Downside with PAM solutions is they tend to be ludicrously expensive. So if you need a PAM solution and you have some valid reasons for them, it usually will have this feature built into it. If you don't, though, there is another one, which is LAPS. So the local administrative password solution. This is something that Microsoft used to charge for, or I think it was just rolled into premium only customers. But it's been free for the last, 5 years. So it's definitely handy. Basically, it's a client-side extension. You can push it out through group policy. Keeps all your admin passwords different. Updates them every 30 days. Again, fairly handy in this case. There are I have some minor issues with Labs, which is it's stored in AD as an attribute, so it's pretty easy to access as an admin. And in fairness, unless you're a domain admin or an enterprise admin, you cannot access them. Again, we talked earlier about most of the directory structure is available. This particular attribute is indeed fairly locked down, but the password is also stored in clear text. So this is a great solution, but again, be aware of some of the issues. And in fact, we have had customers that complain because if you give the service account that runs the Netwrix product that goes out and looks at changes that have taken place, if we have administrative access, we will say, hey, this password was changed from this value to this value because we're looking at all the changes in Active Directory. That, as you can imagine, does not always go over well. So we can certainly change that, right? We can say, hey, I don't want to be able to view changes to this attribute. But clearly, if you're an admin or using an admin account, it's very, very easy to pull that up. There's also a little UI that you can use as well from an administrative standpoint. That gives you a little bit more limited access as far as rolling this out to be able to use with things like help desk admins, etc. But again, it's free, which is awesome. But again, just be aware that there are a couple of downsides. All in all, I think there's less downsides than having all of your admin passwords being the same. But again, be aware that that is definitely an issue. So let's see. I'll take a quick look at the questions window, and it doesn't look like there's too much in here. So awesome. Let me do this. So let's talk about auditing best practices, kind of how we look at things, some of the things that you want to look at and deal with from an audit perspective. Now, I look at auditing as a little bit different, right? Because I see some of the struggles that customers go through with trying to audit things. One of the classic blunders is to kind of go through and enable auditing for everything. That basically gives you auditing for nothing. The number of customers I've seen where I go in and, they got the legacy auditing enabled and they've got, all 9 categories of auditing enabled for success and failure. And, if you're rolling and collecting 4 gigs of logs every, say, 8 minutes, and you're only holding, 4 gigs of logs, or worse, maybe 300 meg or 16 mega logs. So you're literally rolling the logs over, in some cases, every, less than a minute. Kind of hard to audit something if it's not available, right? If I can only go back in time a minute, 10 minutes to see what's happened, not super useful, right? So take a look at what you need to enable and turn on what you need rather than what someone says you need. I run this a lot with auditors, trying to talk them off the ledge. No, everything has to be audited. Everything has to be enabled. That's awesome if you have stock in storage companies and you're going to put up some big SANs and put up some big data farm type technology. And I've seen even small organizations have to deal with huge amounts of auditing. So again, audit what you need, not necessarily what you want. And again, you can change this as well, right? So if you're auditing directory services, probably only needs to be enabled on AD or on your domain controllers rather. Audit object access, file servers primarily. So those types of things. Another thing you can use to cut down is advanced auditing. Some people are aware of this, many people are not. So you've got your classic legacy auditing with your 9 categories. Back in 2008, again, that allowed you to make those changes through PowerShell. 2008 R2, they added a GUI where you could change the advanced auditing on local and group policies. This will significantly reduce the volume of data that you have to pull in. So just to give you an example, I had a client, I was auditing a file server. He was generating 4 gigs of logs every 8 to 10 minutes. It's a lot of logs, right? We went through, we turned on the legacy auditing just for some of the subcategories that he was really looking to audit to give him the information he was looking for. And now he's rolling 4 gigs of logs every 6-8 hours. That's still a lot of logs, but big difference in the volume of data that you're generating on the logs. Fortunately, in the newer versions of the operating systems, if you make the logs really large, 4 gig, for example, which is larger than I would normally otherwise put them, it's about the max size that you should normally put. Be aware that the utilization required on RAM, etc., to maintain those logs is going to be significant. It's not going to be as crazy as it was back in like 2003 days, where it would literally lock the machine cold and take it down, because it's just audited over everything else. But again, be aware that it's going to be resource intensive. So you want to be able to go through and do this. And again, so it allows you to store more information. Just as a caveat, this is something that most people don't know, and I run into this all the time. If you enable advanced auditing on a server, it will override and basically ignore basic auditing going forward. Even if you turn it off, it's very, very hard to turn it off. You have to go through and to kind of tinker with it. So I recommend using it, but be aware that you should use it consistently. So for example, this is the only case that I know of where you can actually set up a group policy and say, hey, I want to push out this auditing for legacy auditing. And then I can go onto a server, set the local policy for advanced auditing, and it will completely ignore that group policy. That is the only instance I know of where local policy can actually override group policy. And that's because once you turn it on, it just snaps everything off. So be aware of that. And I run into that occasionally where people enable it. Just make your life easy, push out advanced auditing if you're going to use it. It's very useful. There's a lot of stuff out there on it. But again, not a lot of people use it or are really familiar with it. So again, things to audit. Again, these are probably no-brainers. You guys are probably looking at a lot of this information now, but again, things like logons and logoffs. Again, look for things like brute force attacks, password spray attacks. So not only you're looking for, 500 failed logons for Bob, but you're looking for one failed logon for 500 users that all come in simultaneously. So those types of attacks. AD account group changes, again, especially looking for a privilege escalation. I was working with a client once, and the reason they called us was because you happened to look into his, again, everybody looks at their main admins group, happened to look at his main admins group, noticed a user by the name of Bob, just Bob, no other attributes, no other information. And of course, he was like, hey guys, who created this account? This is crazy, right? And everyone's like, I don't know. Then they realized they had a problem. So again, when did that happen? They don't know. So you really want to be able to track group changes, especially, but even account changes. Again, privilege escalations, security escalations, etc. Group policy changes. Again, you can do some cool stuff for group policy. So, for example, again, just to give you another example, working on an HR system, my job was to prevent anyone from logging on to the HR system that wasn't authorized to do so, including most of IT. And so what I did was I created a group policy that I applied against these that allowed specific users to be able to log on interactively with the machine. But I also then created a local policy that denied all members of IT. And so what happened was the guy who was pen testing at the time came in and he went in and changed my group policy and added himself. And of course, he wasn't able to log on because he had administrative credentials and was given an explicit deny. I didn't have a way at that time. This was right before I started using Netwrix, which is how I landed here. But if I had, I could have gone right to him and said, hey, why are you messing with my policies? Instead, he had to call me up, kind of defeated and saying, hey, I can't get into this box. But again, if I had known that ahead of time, I would have really taken him to task. So you're always looking for things like group policy changes, file activity, ransomware, malware. Had a client one time where all their HR data disappeared. So when, they don't know. So they suspect it was when their HR director left. People feel ownership of data. It's a pretty well documented phenomenon where she created most of the data. So what they think was she either copied it all off onto a thumb drive and walked out when she retired from there, or she simply just deleted it all. But what happened was they went back, they tried to, as they replaced her and they started spinning things back up and they needed documentation, they realized it just wasn't there. They didn't know why. They went to some of their backups, but it was almost 6 months before they realized that they had problems. If you ever had to go back and restore something after 6 months, it may not go well, right? So, and this was the case. They had some big outages. They had no idea it happened, etc. If it suddenly said, hey, Jane deleted 1,000 files, that's something you can then go back, restore immediately, take some action, right? So it gives you, again, a lot of visibility. Local group and account changes, again, any way to elevate, right? So you want to be able to track those, and then things like local policy changes as well. As just sort of a best practice, as it were, as far as auditing, you want to be able to look at your current environment as well, right? What's normal? So kind of create a baseline of activity to determine what is normal. So things like average number of logons per day, failed logons. That is probably one of the first things that will show you that something's terribly wrong, by the way, and I'll kind of show you that a little bit in the demonstration. File activity. So again, if you normally have someone reading 1,000 files a day, that might not be any great shakes. So you want to be able to get an idea of what your sort of baselines are so you can deal with it. Because if, again, you've got 1,000 reads a day, it's going to be hard to determine if someone suddenly went out and copied, 500 files. So you need to be able to kind of pick through some of that noise. And if you don't have a good idea as far as what you're doing on a regular basis, it's hard to do that. Things like non-owner activity as well, non-owner mailbox activity. That's a good one to look at, either through whether you're using Office 365 or you still have Exchange on-prem. That's good activity to look at as well. And then again, determining what the current status is. So who has admin rights currently in Active Directory? Who has admin rights on your servers? If you're dealing with SOX or some of the other compliances, that's a question you have to answer every couple of weeks or months or whatever, which are your compliances you're dealing with. That's a big question. Who currently has access to your files? That's, again, relatively important information. Where are your files located, especially your sensitive data? Do you have a good handle on where your sensitive data is located? And again, where are your current policies in place for servers and users? So again, password policies, security policies, etc. Especially because there's a lot of turnover with IT, it's very hard to figure out kind of what's going on in someone's environment. So let me do this. I'm going to switch over and give you a little bit of a demonstration. So if you, I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but at Netwrix, what we do is we build software basically to track changes to different platforms as well as what is going on currently. So just to give you an idea, I'll run through some basic reports, sort of, ideas as far as things you should be looking for. So we'll talk about things like logon activity. Logons, failed logons. I really love summary reports. The reason I love summary reports is it's very, very easy to see that something is wrong. So again, I got some failed logons here, I got some successful logons. Hey, my administrator account tried to successfully logged on 927 times in the last 2 days. That's something I probably want to take a closer look at. Something's probably not right. That client I mentioned earlier where he found Bob in his domain admins list, I ran this report. He had, I think, about 1,000 users. I ran this report, and you can see there are multiple lines per page. He had 10,000 pages. And on most of his accounts, he had between 2,000 and 5,000 failed logons just for the previous 2 days. So we were able to click down through, and you can drill into this and take a closer look and see, hey, had no idea what was going on, but they were, brute force attacking, just hammering away relentlessly at one of his controllers. One of the problems with this, obviously, is the security implications, but two, it's going to be hard for your controller to authenticate users when it's got, hundreds of thousands of additional, BS logons that's dealing with as well. So there you deal with some configuration issues. So this is an awesome type of way to look at data, to be able to pull that information in. Again, it tells you right away that something is terribly wrong. You can also look at, I'll pop up to AD real quick because we were talking about that. Something like all AD changes. Again, a lot of different ways to see this. But again, group changes are a big one, right? So here my domain admins group was changed by this guy in this date and time. And these two users were both added. Again, that's kind of critical information. We use some interesting methodology as well to go through and condense the data so that we put things into a single record instead of the 4 that this would actually have generated. But again, you can see things like, hey, I added a subnet. Is that normal? Probably not. Machines that were removed, cleanup, attribute changes, creating OU, stuff like that. So general AD, just trying to take a look at what's going on. But again, things like security group changes. So you're down through here. And then again, one of the big ones that I happen to be a fan of is object security changes. You have no idea how much it kills me to go in and look and see at the root of the directory or something else, some random person or some random group that I don't know that has delegated access to something that it may or may not need. So here, again, very easy to see that on my corporate OU, I delegated out privileges for this admin password reset group for the ability to, add and reset passwords. So in this case, probably pretty benign, but again, something you probably want to keep track of when those types of things happen. Group policy changes. Everyone loves group policy changes. So again, just to give you kind of a general idea, and I'll probably kick up the pace a little bit because I don't want to run out of time. This is not super interesting as far as group policy. Although I will say again, if you're using some sort of SIEM or you've ever looked at the logs, one of the things you'll notice is they're terrible. The default logs are terrible. Here it gives you all the different details, before and after values, etc. It's pretty easy to read. And then again, just to go through, I'm not going to go through all these reports. I don't want to bore you guys to tears. File server activity, again, what's going on? Overview reports with graphs. Again, big fan of summaries. Also, again, if you're dealing with SOCs, for example, it's the one that I'm most familiar with, for better or for worse, permission changes. You need to kick these out every month. Very easy to set these up for delegation. And then finally, in this case, you can see we cover a variety of platforms. Again, Windows servers. Someone's added as a local admin, for example, you probably want to know that. Again, local audit policy changes. And then not only can we see track changes, but again, when you get into that kind of baselining information and the ability to see what's going on currently, again, if I need to know who my local admins are, excuse me, I can do that. My current local users and groups, configuration details, server inventory, stuff like that. So this is kind of a cool report. This allows you to do a lot of baselining for things like, is the OS, valid, or does it need to be replaced? Hey, again, 2003, right? What your current antivirus status are, again, local users and groups, etc. And then you can do the same for all these other pieces. So something like file servers, for example, probably stop going into some of these reports. But again, file and folder permissions, who has access to this stuff? Kind of important, right? So if I want to say, hey, here's my HR data, my HR folder, I want to see all subfolders, and I will turn this off for now. Pretty easy to see who has access to this. Now this is going to give me explicit access. Probably want to see both, right? So this will give you explicit access, which is awesome from a security and a compliance perspective. Hey, my admin has full control. This random dude has full control, which is not best practice. File server admins have full control. HR Global has modified, payroll has read. Again, subfolders, we're only going to show you the subfolders are different. If you got 1,000 subfolders and they're all the same, no one cares. Or, the 3 that are different are the ones you want to see. Now, again, from a compliance perspective, this is pretty handy. But what if I want to send this out to my HR director? And again, I can subscribe to this, but again, now I want to break this out and I want to expand these out. So I want to say, hey, you know what? That's great. Now I know what groups and users have explicit access. Who has implicit access? Do all these people belong in here? Does this guy should have modify access? Most people don't know, who they're dealing with as far as groups or who's in those groups. So again, gives you some really neat capabilities to see that as well. And again, you can do that through file server or AD group policy. But one of the other things I wanted to show briefly is the data discovery and classification. So this has become more and more critical for a lot of users or a lot of organizations where they just don't know where their stuff is. To be honest, it's all over the place. I got a couple of different contents in here, but if I go into HR data, for example, I can see I have CCPA and HIPAA and legal documents in here, for example. If I look at my public directory, like most public directories, again, I try to make sure my lab environment, sadly, is as close to others as possible. You can see I've got things like PII data, and I can go in there and I can see what that is. So we can go through and we can classify data. And we see this a lot with things like the new DSAR requests, right? So data subject access requests. If you guys aren't familiar with these, you're probably going to become familiar with them. Big piece of GDPR, CCPA. Everybody's rolling these out in their, data access piece of choice, right? So again, that right to be forgotten, the ability to call up and say, hey, I'm such and such, can you remove me? You can do those pretty easily. Again, trying to take a lot of the tedium out of your life to, not make your life as terrible and miserable as possible. And then again, there's just a lot of dashboarding and stuff like that, which I won't go into a huge amount of details. I realize I'm kind of running up against the thing, but again, this enterprise overview gives you a real nice graphical view of what's going on. There's a lot of just test data, but you can see here's my data access trend. I had almost 6,000 modifications on the 15th. So many, in fact, that everything else is just crushed down here. So that's probably something that's concerning to me, right? If I don't know what these are. So again, I can pop into these and I can see that these are all security permissions that I got through and made a couple of weeks ago. But if I didn't know what that was, that's something I'd probably be curious about, right? So again, this is where you get into those baselines. What is going on inside of your environment? If you do not know, it is really hard to detect things that are different when you have no idea what's going on currently. So again, be aware of how this rolls out. And there's a lot of other trending and graphical reports. There's things like a risk assessment. This actually takes that, again, what's going on currently and drops it into a single interface for you. So again, servers with inappropriate operating systems, files and folders accessible by the Everyone group. There's tons of these. Good colleague of mine used to go through and he'd ask, hey, do you guys use the Everyone group? And of course, almost every client says, no, of course not. That's ridiculous, right? Who uses the Everyone group when they're assigning permissions? And then, 12 pages of the Everyone group later, clearly, if they're not using it, somebody else was, right? And again, this is where you get into a lot of these legacy permissions. One of the reasons this dashboard was created was we get a lot of requests from customers that would say, hey, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. I just started working here. It's a train wreck. I don't know where to start first. And they would literally ask us, tell us where to start. So that's actually why this sort of risk assessment overview was created, was to give you that type of capability to see what's going on. And obviously you can do alerts and some really cool searches, etc. So again, designed to give you some additional sort of capabilities. And again, you can do things like, let's see, I don't go into this really, but then I'll probably end this out. But again, from a compliance perspective, if you need to know what a specific user is doing, especially if you spell their username correctly, maybe you want to see everything they've done in the last month, you can do some really neat queries in here as well. This might be a little too much information. And maybe I say, hey, you know what? I really only care about Active Directory, right? So I continue to refine this. I can actually refine it off of the data that I pull up. So I want to say, hey, you know what? I'm just going to include Active Directory. I don't care about everything else. Maybe I want to do a time filter for within certain hours, or within a certain users within a certain group, those types of things. But now I can see what's going on. So for example, I had a client with a really interesting use case where I went through and showed them this, and they said, hey, that's something that we could really use, a couple of weeks ago. And I said, what happened a few weeks ago? And he said, hey, we hired a new admin. We gave him his credentials. And then like 3 days later, he comes up and says, hey guys, thanks for the login credentials. Can you, give me admin rights too? And they're like, well, what are you talking about? So turns out that when they create his account, they create his account, and they went into, admin as a domain admin, or because of course everyone has to be added as a domain admin, right? Again, probably could have been an account operator, but I don't work there. But again, added this guy as a domain admin, but didn't actually add him, added somebody else. And now the company was scrambling because they realized they had given some random user administrative level access to the organization. And because they're heavily audited, their auditor said, hey, that's great. Can you tell me what this guy did over the last 3 days? The answer was they couldn't, right? And with this type of tool, it's really tailor-made to be able to answer those types of queries. Did he know he could get into different files and folders that he didn't normally have access to? Again, trying to do those types of queries manually is extremely difficult. So again, this tool is really just designed to make your life easier, relatively straightforward in that case. So hopefully that will give you guys some useful information. And I think there should probably, to answer Jeff's question, there should be some documentation around privilege level access. Again, there may be like some blog posts. I don't know if there's some official stuff from Microsoft. Microsoft complicates the heck out of everything, unfortunately, as far as how you set up OUs, et cetera. So there's some best practice out there. Again, keep it relatively simple. If you haven't played with things like account operators group, give someone access, let them play around with it and see some of the, any potential shortcomings they have, because you don't want to limit someone from doing their job. You don't want security to be so egregious that nobody can get any work done. You have to walk a fine line between productivity and security, and that's a pretty critical piece. Actually, let me do this. I realize I have a couple of slides left that I totally forgotten about, so let me throw those up very, very quickly and I'll blow through them. So again, if you've never heard of us, well, I guess you have now. So Netwrix goes out. If you're familiar with NIST, this kind of follows that sort of NIST model of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Again, finding out where your issues reside, where your sensitive information is, who has access to that, fixing that, alerting on it, etc. There is also, if you're curious as far as what we cover and what we actually are able to address, it's a lot of systems, right? So almost the entire Microsoft stack, AD, group policy, obviously, but things like SharePoint, SharePoint Online, SharePoint Online, yeah, I don't want to get down to, but again, we can even look at things like SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, at Azure AD, and that gives us a lot of additional visibility, right? So for things like OneDrive, that basically just sits on SharePoint Online. Teams leverages a bunch of those different mechanisms. If you're using Teams and you're chatting, for example, it's going to get dropped into a mailbox. If you're uploading files, it's going to be in SharePoint Online. So Microsoft uses very heavily a lot of the other back-end stuff. But again, most of the Microsoft stack, Oracle, VMware, a bunch of stuff, Nutanix. So again, if you're looking at files, structures, Windows, Dell, EMC, NetApp, Nutanix, etc. If you found any of this product useful, I hope you find the demonstration or the presentation useful. But if you're interested in the product, maybe you're running it already, maybe you're not. If you want to play around with it, feel free to download it. It's at netwrix.com. You can download it, do a demo. We also have a lot of neat resources. So if you go to our website, there's a lot of just cool stuff out there. Like I said, blog posts, white papers, all kinds of really cool information. We really like to help out customers. We really like to do a lot of presentations like this where, we like to show our product, but we also want to help people be more secure and have a better understanding as far as what they're dealing with. So there's all kinds of resources. A lot of the stuff I covered today, we covered in actually a lot more detail and some of the other things out here, things like connecting AD to Azure AD, etc. So there's some really good stuff out there as far as webinars and other types of things as well. So at this point, I want to thank you all. Again, I hope you found this to be useful, interesting, entertaining. Probably not so much, but I want to thank you for staying with me. Again, if you're logged in, then you're going to get dropped on, and you're going to be up for some Amazon gift cards that they're giving away as well. So worst case, hopefully that's a consolation prize if you thought, wow, this guy's terrible. So hopefully that's not the case. But again, if you have feedback, I always appreciate it. If you have questions, again, please let me know. I'll hang out for a couple of minutes in case you're furiously punching away. But other than that, I want to thank you all for your time today, and enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the this sort of virtual summit. I think there's some great information out there. So again, thank you very much. Interesting. So here's an interesting question. So how can Active Directory be compromised or hacked? Usually through user credentials. Phishing, spear phishing, very, very easy. Those are honestly the most common ones. So those types of hacks. So pricing. So if you're looking at pricing, this is relatively reasonable. We do subscription. We can also do perpetual if you'd like. For 200 users, it depends on what you want to take a look at, honestly. I would reach out to these people. They're usually pretty cool. They're not those salespeople for the most part. Reach out and let them know. For just AD, it's going to be pretty reasonable. I haven't looked at the pricing. They don't give me the pricing, to be honest with you, because I've dealt with questions like this. But couple grand, I think, for AD for your size. So that's a wild ballpark number. But again, back to this original question. Yeah, sadly, I know it's well, you can talk to us as well, right? So, and again, if you have specific questions around, the product, you can talk to, solutions engineers, and we can give you the scoop of what's going on. So, but again, AD is usually hacked for a variety of ridiculous things. Again, credential harvesting, that's a good one. You've got key loggers that are out there. Again, that's why it's so nice to have, credential scraping from RAM, stuff like that, which is why, again, something like the Protected Users Group is very, very effective. Like I said, if you talk to pen testers, most of it's phishing and spear phishing. You would be surprised how many suckers they get. I get those all the time. I've got pretty adapted. Every once in a while, I'll get one. I'm like, wait, is this a valid one? I don't think so. So those are probably the most effective ways to get an Active Directory. But again, if you can read the directory and you are silly enough to put in credentials, for example, and some people do, really easy to pull that data because you don't have to have elevated rights to get in there. So there are a lot of different ways to go through. And again, it's all about sort of, cyber hygiene, if you will, making sure you're following kind of best practices and going through. So hopefully that gives you a little. Actually, if you want more information, there's a bunch of stuff on how to hack on our website. There's a lot of really neat webinars as far as anatomy of phishing attacks, how they actually get pulled off. We even dive into like the types of software and how to actually legitimately launch a phishing attack. And one of the things you'll see is it's pretty easy. It really is much more complicated to get in and actually build a legitimate message, right? So if the message says, hey, your PayPal credentials you put in now, you secure guy, you're like, yeah, not so much, right? But again, they're getting more and more sophisticated. So if you can build a good message, you get somebody on an off day. I had a director one time, who was my boss, the last place I worked. He went in, first cup of coffee in the morning, sat down, asked about his PayPal credentials. He punched them in, and as soon as he did that, I snapped open. Oh my God, what have I just done? Went in, reset his credentials real quick, and then he's like, you know what? Let me reach out to these guys and just give them a heads up that there's this phishing attack out there that are mimicking this. And they said, hey, that's funny. Your account's been locked out 12 times in the last like 5 minutes. So they grabbed his credentials and started hammering away to try to, take his funds. I'll tell you, he got a lot of grief for that, especially as the IT director for the organization, to do something that dumb. But to his credit, he basically emailed everyone and said, "Hey guys, I fell for this. This is how easy it is to do. Be careful." And he kind of put himself on the line for that and received a lot of grief. But I got to give him credit for that, right? I mean, you need to make sure that you're educated and that you know what's going on. So. Awesome. Well, I think I'm over the time, so I will apologize. But again, if you have any other questions, please reach out to us. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Otherwise, I will, again, thank you all for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.